Alright, so I'm going to talk a little bit about neuroscience in this video, and I'm going to combine the neurosciences and philosophy. There's a new field that's growing in today's world called neurophilosophy, and I've dabbled into this a little bit. Patricia Churchland and her husband, Paul Churchland, have wrote some really good books. There's a book called Matter and Consciousness by Paul Churchland. A couple of the questions he raises are interesting because they're kind of trying to figure out, is the brain, of course we know the brain is physical, but how does that relate to mental activity? I always like to think about neuroscience as not just a theoretical science. It's more so about, understanding how we work, how our minds work, and then applying that to become better human beings. What the brain really is. It is a neural tissue, right? So it's unlike any other organ in the body because it has electrochemical properties. And so there are other cells in the body that use electricity, but the brain uses electricity far more than any other organ. And this is what makes it interesting, because in today's world with AI and technology, we are starting to realize that the same electricity and algorithms and kind of the code that we're using to generate these incredibly intelligent models, that same electricity is being utilized in your brain. So is your brain just a input-output machine? And that's actually a really good question. I'm gonna maybe answer that throughout this video. But before we get to that, it's really important to understand, how does a neuroscientist think? Like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist, but when you think about neuroscience as a whole field, you have to realize that, there is no field that is as multidisciplinary or as multimodal as neuroscience. I mean, this is the most incredible field, in my opinion. Of course, I'm biased because I did a major in it, and I plan to go into neurology in the future. But the idea is that it combines a lot of different sciences. So, people who are interested in psychology, there's a behavior component to neuroscience, understanding how the brain impacts your behavior, your personality. People who are interested in biology, there's the whole molecular part in the brain, Ultimately, genes code for proteins, and proteins are neurotransmitters. So if you want to understand how neurons talk to one another through synapse, that is through proteins. So you have to understand the molecular basis. You also have to understand how neurons make connections with other neurons, and that's the genetic code. Why does one neuron make a connection with a neuron from a different area in the brain? Well, that's because of genes that it has, right? So the idea is that, psychology, biology, chemistry, physics, all of it put together, you have a field which is neuroscience, which I think is just fascinating. Francis Crick, who is one of the founders of the whole central dogma of molecular biology, of, genes or DNA, RNA, protein, that kind of chain, he said, there is no scientific study more vital to the humans than his own brain, or than their own brain. And the idea is that, understanding how your brain works is the most useful thing a man could do, in my opinion, because it allows him to then use that knowledge to change himself for the better. And this is where neuroplasticity comes in, this idea that your brain is malleable, it's plastic, it's changeable, it's not fixed and rigid, right? So a lot of people say that, you stop growing your prefrontal cortex by the age of 25. And that's clearly wrong. Your brain is evolving and changing throughout your whole lifespan. And understanding how neuroplasticity works is important, because then you can change your brain in a positive manner. And this is where things like, trauma, stress, anxiety, depression, they negatively change your brain. But then there's ways to utilize neuroplasticity through things like meditation, going out in nature, social support, therapy. All these things can rewire your brain and change it for the better. So the idea is that, understanding how your brain works, and then utilizing the methods to change it in a way that can benefit you, is these 2 points already sell the idea that neuroscience is a topic worth studying. And now you bring in a whole concept of philosophy in there, things like consciousness, AI, intelligent models, understanding morality and ethics, and put it all together into this beautiful concept of neurophilosophy. You have something very beautiful. You have the science of the mind. Psychology up until today was focused on behavior, and it was focused on, a one-on-one variable kind of experiment where there's an independent variable and then there's a dependent variable. You change one thing and then you see how that changes another variable. But now neuroscience is coming in and saying it's too complex. It's not one-on-one. There are too many confounding variables, essentially too many factors involved in producing behavior or in producing a function of the brain, that you need to have a multimodal perspective. And this is where, the correlation versus causation debate comes in. I worked in a neuroscience lab, and, majority of my work that I presented at conferences was involving correlation. So, you take one variable, for example, you take the volume or the thickness of a brain region, right? So you take the volume and thickness of the prefrontal cortex, and then you correlate it with, trauma, or you correlate it with some sort of psychopathology like PTSD or anxiety. And then you say, a thinner cortex, a thinner prefrontal cortex is correlated with higher anxiety symptoms. Okay, that's just a correlation, right? And neuroimaging is very important in today's world because it's allowing us to understand, physiological changes that are happening due to various environmental factors. But then again, it's also important to understand that is just correlation, because you're just taking two variables and seeing how they change with one another. But that doesn't mean that there are not other variables involved, right? So this is how a neuroscientist thinks. He thinks in two terms: necessity and sufficiency. So the example I gave you, the prefrontal cortex, is it necessary to produce higher anxiety symptoms? Modern neuroscience would say yes, it is. It is involved in it's involved in the fear circuitry and dampening the amygdala, which is another region involved with increasing fear, increasing fight or flight response. So it dampens that response. So yes, the prefrontal cortex is necessary. Is it sufficient is the key, right? So by itself, can it explain the anxiety symptoms? And the answer is no. So a neuroscientist, or for that matter, a neurophilosopher, will always have these two concepts and try to think of it. And when you think about it in this perspective, what you realize is that there's always never a one-on-one connection. You can't say one brain region does this, or you can't say one network is responsible for this type of behavior. It's never that simple. And this is why neuroscience is a fascinating topic, is because it's so complex that every answer you find to a question leads you to pursue another question. For me, it's like my research involved understanding how different volumes and thicknesses of different brain regions relate to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and how we can use that to predict improvement in symptoms over time, right? But all of it was correlation. So, the next question I asked is, well, what about damage to the brain, right? So we have people with lesions, we have people with strokes because of traumatic brain injury. How does that relate to different, pathologies, psychopathologies, or in general, even, physiological pathologies, biological pathologies, things like, stroke, dementia. These things could be related to changes in the brain morphology, or just structural changes of the brain may make you prone to developing a brain disorder, right? So that gets one step into the causation, where you're saying the damage to this brain has caused a specific thing, because before that damage it didn't exist. So you have to be a little clever in these experiments, and neuroscientists will utilize brain damage as a way to get into causation. They will use different kinds of animal models to change genes and then look at how those changes can impact personality and behavior. For example, one of my professors actually used zebrafish. He changed various types of genes, and there are very genius ways to kind of get into the genome and kind of play around that. I'm not going to get into that, but the idea is that you change genetics in an animal, and then you see its behavior, or then you look at its personality or its interaction with other animals or other creatures. And he found some very fascinating things. He was able to connect he was able to categorize 6 different personalities to specific genetic expressions, which is really cool. Now you can kind of get into this causation, because then you express this gene or this set of genes, and then you have a specific behavior that is exhibited, and it's not there when you don't express that. So that is, that shows that it's necessary, right? So stuff like this, people are combining. This is the field of behavioral neuroscience. There are people who are into affective neuroscience as well as sensory neuroscience. These are different branches of neuroscience. And then of course there's cognitive neuroscience, which is studying the mind and understanding thought processes. And this is, I think, one of the most complex fields, with people trying to figure out how does the mind work, and can we use neuroimaging and neurotechnology to basically map the mind. Can I map a thought to a state of neural activity? Coming up with this theory called the neural correlates of consciousness. Again, correlates is very important, right? So people are saying, can we find the minimum set of neural properties that can define consciousness, or that can create consciousness, right? So consciousness is already divided into 2 things. There is awareness and wakefulness. So someone can be awake, for example, in like a vegetative state. Your vitals are going. You are able to, pick up things and reflexively move. Like, for example, your reflexes will work, but you are not aware of people saying things, or kind of, your eyes, your pupils will move according to movement, but you're not consciously taking in that input, right? So people are asking questions like, can we come up with a minimal neural set that can define consciousness? And this is a very fascinating topic, because this then goes into things like the neural chip that Elon Musk is talking about. People are talking about different wearables that you can use to change the brain. There's already something called the transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is like a magnet that you put on your prefrontal cortex, and you rewire your part of the brain that regulates emotion. So we are already getting into this field of using technology and kind of seeing the mind as a physical organ, which is the brain, right? So if you want to change the mind, which in today's world a lot of people need to, things like addictions, things like anxiety, depression is big, suicide is huge. All these things are drastically impacting people's daily lifestyle, and it's making them miserable, and they're not able to change it through a cognitive way. Therapy, essentially the way therapy works is that you talk to a therapist and they will try to change your thinking patterns so that you don't fall into this rabbit hole of just following your maladaptive or your distortions in your mind. Instead, you're able to think clearly, and that's what a therapist does. But it's more complex to change thoughts than to change circuitry, right? So if you use electricity, to change the brain, then you can then in turn change the mental factors that come afterwards. So people are looking into that as well. But going back to this aspect of the neural correlates of consciousness, right? Can we come up with a set of properties? For example, we say the brainstem, right? The brainstem is a very important region of the brain that is involved in respiration, that is involved in vital signs, that is involved in keeping you awake. And it's actually, if you look at sleep versus awake states, the brainstem is actually the most involved one. Just like that, there are some other regions. There's a reticular formation. There's a pituitary gland that, or not pituitary, there's a pineal gland that secretes melatonin, which is a critical hormone or a neurohormone that's involved with sleep. So all these different regions are involved in consciousness. So can we come up with a theory that says we need these things and we have consciousness? And if we can get that, then that would be a predecessor to creating consciousness in robots, consciousness in machines, because then we can start to mimic these systems into a autonomous being. So it's a scary thought, but we can start to utilize neuroscience in a way that can not only help us understand about ourselves, but also bring technologies to life. But now kind of bringing all of this neurophilosophy and neural circuitry into the realm of spirituality. This is the final frontier, because this kind of bridges materialism and spirituality and puts it into a perfect blender. Because all of spiritual practice is geared towards training the mind. But what does that mean? Training the mind is synonymous with neuroplasticity, right? So can we change the brain in a way that allows us to be more peaceful, more grounded, more in tune with our true nature, and ultimately start to become more aware of the little things in our life? You know, the Buddha taught mindfulness and the idea that you should pay attention to the small things in your life, because those are the moments of joy. Joy is not in, grandiose things of going on a cruise or, buying an expensive car, or those things can give you happiness, but they last for, a short time. Instead, if you can enjoy the daily walks, the tea every day, looking at the trees, listening to the birds, having a genuine conversation with your sibling or your partner, stuff like that is what's going to rewire your brain, and it's going to make it less on autopilot and more on a more conscious, wholesome energy. So, to sum it up, neuroscience is a multimodal science. It involves the study of the brain, which is more biological, and the mind, which is more psychological. And now philosophy and spirituality is bringing its own mixture, and now we have this concept of neurophilosophy who's trying to understand consciousness. All these fields put together, we can have a true understanding of what it means to be a human being, and can you replicate a human